Welcome to Preserving Game Design History, a call to action. This panel's brief is culture only survives as well as its people preserve it. This roundtable will emphasize the importance of archiving and preserving game design history like we're doing right now, featuring librarians, archivists, and scholars who believe in the importance of documenting the history and process behind game design for future generations. I'm Jason Morningstar. I'll be moderating this panel. I'm a game designer active in the tabletop and LARP spaces, and my professional background is in electronic content accessibility and information retrieval. Down on the end we have Rebecca Slitt, she, her. Rebecca is a writer and editor of interactive fiction and a LARP runner and designer in a variety of styles. In a previous life, Rebecca was a professor of medieval history. And next to her is our first Kate, Kate Hill, she, her. Kate is an academic librarian, a LARP organizer and designer. Her professional work focuses on questions of how to preserve digital objects for the long term on a daily basis. And our second Kate, Kate Freedman, they, them. Kate is an academic librarian, LARPite, and historian of the Anglo-Atlantic region in the 17th and 18th century with a background in archives. And second, Jason, he, him. Jason is an assistant professor of art education at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio. He uses LARP in his research to explore how art teachers think about systems of power. Join me in welcoming them.
People have newspapers in their attic. And if we are not intentional about this now, what we are losing right now, especially with all the digital creation, it is incredible how little people have thought about digital preservation. And we're starting to get there, but there's so much, and if we don't focus on it now, even 30 years ago, we're not going to recognize what we have lost and what this culture is. Cultural memory, you think it's long, but it's not. It's really not. So that's why it's important to preserve.
Yeah. I was the one that actually, proposed this because I was at WorldCon this past summer, and there was a panel that was this. Except WorldCon is an organization that is 75 years old. It was the 75th WorldCon, and they were just starting to have that conversation, in as a panel then, right? And so, from my perspective, I was like, we need to start having this conversation now so that all this ephemera doesn't get lost. And I would also add onto that, just know that everyone in this room, at this conference, in the LARP community generally, is a historical actor.
Yes.
And you are important. Even if you don't think you're important, you are important.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I don't disagree. It's just powerful statements. I'm soaking it in. So one of the things that I would say about it is that LARPs are experiences. They're constructed experiences, and experiences are best understood through multiple perspectives. And one of the reasons for that is that they have different meanings for multiple people. So if you don't document them early, if you don't document them when they're meaningful, when they're situated in context, when there's certain things going on in the world or with the people who are playing them, then you are sacrificing meaning. And you might have a skeleton that's left at the end, but you've lost what mattered. So to me, the preservation is in part this attempt to understand meaning from those experiences with the expectation, as an art person, that in the future, being able to look back and see that meaning will provide points of connection or a place to build upon or something that matters again, to return to something that was. And that's just not as possible if we don't make the efforts to preserve now.
So as someone who takes really genuine pleasure in recycling mountains of ephemera from every game I ever play, what should we be preserving? Like, what makes something historically important or worth saving? It's kind of a trick question, but I'm interested in your answer.
No, everything. I mean, within reason, like, yeah, you can't save all 5 copies of every in-game document. We are limited to some degree by available space and personal resources, and digital preservation is awesome and expands the amount of storage capacity that we have. But I will defer to the librarians and information technologists on this one, because you folks know way better than I do what the capabilities are.
Rebecca, when you say we, who are we talking about? Whose responsibility is this?
Ooh, that is an awesome question.
I'm sorry to be throwing all these out, but I'm
that is awesome. So everybody can do it. Every player, every organizer, every writer absolutely can do it. Like, you don't need anybody's permission to to be history or to do history. You are already in it by the fact that you have enacted LARP. I think it is more helpful for certain purposes if there are centralized repositories. Like, I got my start in campaign LARP, and oh my gosh, if there is no central repository of what happened, you are lost. You cannot rely on decentralized information if you're trying to piece together, the complex political negotiations that happen in your campaign that you need to maintain continuity for the next time, or, how many of these magic items are still out so we can make sure to distribute more. You need, like, in those cases, for those particular purposes, there's an advantage in having certain people designated to do it. But everybody can, and everybody should.
Would the rest of you agree with that?
That everybody can and everybody will.
I think everyone, with everyone, I think that you really want to. We want centralized, I think, or at least collections. I think that everyone has a responsibility who creates to save these things, but then perhaps get them to someone who has. I don't think that everyone needs to have the skills to create the metadata, to make it searchable and findable. I don't want everyone to have these skills because I don't have a job. To do the digital preservation that is necessary, to have the server space, honestly, for some of this stuff that is necessary, the backups, if it is paper material, the archival conditions that you need to preserve physical material. So yes, save your things, but make sure that you have what we really need is a plan, and a group of people with a specialty in this area who are willing to create that and then reach out to the community for the thing. That's how archives have done it for years and years and years. But the problem is they've always done it 40 years later, in which they're like, oh no, that was really, the civil rights movement was really important. Mind blown. So that's why I really now you guys can create these things and give them to us. Us. Oh no, I volunteered for something else.
I guess what I'm hearing is that there's a role for lay people and there's a role for professionals.
Yes.
That's great. Would you agree with that alternate candidate?
Yeah. Yes, librarians are your friends. Be nice to your librarians.
I think when we think about what it is that librarians do, they are both the keepers of knowledge, right? All the way back to the Library of Alexandria, but they also create access to things, right? And so, it's not behind a paywall if it's in a library. It is not, well, unless it's a business library, but we're just presuming academic library, public library. It's not behind a paywall. It is, and that's the point. And it's searchable.
Yeah.
That metadata allows people to Google. We think Google is all great, right? But it's not. It actually has a lot of problems because not everything has metadata And so, you know, sometimes, like, you don't even know, it's like an iceberg. You don't know what Google is hiding from you.
And if you don't know the right term to search.
Right,
you know,
and so that is the reason why libraries, I think, are, you know, the ultimate best place for, you know, preserving this history. Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on this?
I have some caveats. So I agree that having a particular set of skill absolutely helps in the archiving and in the referencing, because that is a set of skills that I personally do not have, and I know and respect many archivists, including people at this table. But caveat one is that what gets saved in a given circumstance is always going to foreground a different set of priorities. And if it's always the archivist, then they're going to tend to look at the grander stories. Not necessarily; they may just preserve whatever. But it's possible to have a personal archive that is the same event and it'll be different. And that's not really an answer per se, but it's more of a little bit of a warning. But the other thing is, I would say that contemporary library and museums are social spaces. They are a place where things are certainly stored and where knowledge is facilitated. But one of the things that they are most of all is a place of engagement. So they have to be more than an archive. They have to be a place for people to meet and discuss and engage with the ideas that are there.
We got some questions. First of all, I'm sorry that I derailed your original question. I really want to know what we're supposed to preserve. So be thinking about
Yes.
that. And your question?
I would echo the point about are the libraries the best space for this? Because, you know, what if you get a library director like we do have at the University of Cincinnati who wants engagement with the collections you have and a Starbucks and that the library is an active socially used space rather than actually, you know, because we get this number cited where it's like 60% of all the collections are not even, you know, checked out, et cetera, which then becomes liable for purging. Now, if I were purging things, LARP ephemera would be maybe the first thing to go.
So I think that's the difference between archive and collections.
Yes.
So like as a collections development and electronic resources librarian and an avid reader,
Read it all.
I have weeded so many books. What we weed and what we do, things like that, those are things that have multiple copies of and are published.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here are things that are unique. And we would, I think that it would make most librarian archivists like basically like if their library director told them to get rid of that kind of material, they would like take their library degrees and like burn it in front of the person. Like that is an anathema to our souls. So, but
Yeah, you commit when you take something in. So that the difficulty that I think may well exist, and you are right, I think, in terms of like whether or not a librarian, an archivist, someone who has control over like what is going to be taken into a collection, whether or not they'll think that our stuff is important. But that choice will be made at the beginning, rather than like once they accept it, it is like their burden for the rest of time. You know, I think. And the other thing that I will say about, in terms of how libraries are handling non-unique materials, is that there's more and more coalition forming where, and consortial collecting, so that like basically like on the East Coast, like all the academic libraries like make sure to have X number of copies of any given thing.
we do the same thing in our department.
So that way, like, there's always copies that are accessible, again, through, like, interlibrary loan, and there are more and more combined catalogs where all of this stuff is searchable. So I think, you know, the difficulty is going to be finding an archive that is willing to take the stuff in the first place, and that will have to do with, like, what we decide to keep, what we decide to offer to the archive.
Which
right?
is going to be a good segue into the next question.
Yeah.
Jose had a question first, though.
So is there such a thing, or is there a need for a thing as, not a thing, but an archivist or librarian of games? And if someone wanted to get into that, how would they go about it?
Yes, I want that job.
I think that there is
are
a
a
need.
few.
I think we run into a couple of practical questions. For me, one of the things I would say that I want to back up a little and touch on Evan's question because it comes back to this, is because again, I'm an art person, I would come at it as a museum where you have stuff that is on display and everything else is off. Whenever you put it on display, you rearrange it and it foregrounds a new story that can matter to contemporary audiences. So I do believe that there's a need for that in terms of having things together. In terms of how that's going to look, especially if we're looking at an international community that's widely disparate, that wants to be able to participate, it's difficult to do with physical ephemera, and it's hard to do with physical objects. And how to make that viable without finances backing it up is, to me, awful tricky.
Just the Murray collection, the
Yeah.
Rubenstein's Special Collections Library at Duke, they got this massive accession of gaming material and ephemera, and it's just gorgeous. It's a beautiful collection, but it was a real burden on the Rubenstein that it was like a year's work for somebody to get it all cataloged and for to have metadata applied.
The Strong also has a good collection.
Who did?
The Strong Museum of Play. I think they got all of
Yeah.
Sid Saxon's papers and stuff like that.
And so I would say, like, in terms of what to save, you know, I think that we should, as a community, be thinking like, well, everything can be historically significant to someone down the line, right? In terms of some scholar down the line. Like I studied, you know, the history of enslaved people in the 18th century, and nobody in the 18th century, except for the enslaved people, thought that they were significant at the time, but they're exceedingly significant. And so, you know, it's like, that's the sort of thing, like, we're not gonna know, right? But that's not, so our choice in terms of like what to archive in a library is different from our choice in terms of what to preserve as individuals right now. Because the library, you know, what I would say, you know, would be a good first step, or could be a good first step, is to look at the archives that already have, you know, preserving game history as part of their mission. And they do all have like written missions, and they have, you know, their collections are findable, so you can figure out where these collections are, and then, you know, figure out like, okay, so what are they interested in, right? And that's going to differ from archive to archive, and that is where like the individual personalities will come into it. So like somebody might be like, yeah, I want to preserve Vincent's games, but I don't want to have anything to do with like preserving the ephemera from living games as an organization, right? You know, and that's like, I mean, I think that would be silly, but you know, that is a valid thing for an archivist to say, and that's kind of, it's just, you just gotta sort of ask what they're up for, you know, and it's about creating relationships with archives.
Other thoughts on what to preserve?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To me, so, as a person who's done, like especially like the history of readers and reading is actually something that I'm really into. What's the most beautiful and valuable things are things that are, you know, ephemera is wonderful and that's all great, but it's like where you have the people who can see the thoughts, where you can see an actual, like the narrative, where you can see the creative process behind, behind and the experiences and the narratives of people experiencing this experience. That is the gold, and that is the stuff that you. So you think that your notes that you use to design your games or build your experience, or your notes you take in during game and things like that are useless? That is what is the heart beauty of, because that tells the personal story, and that is what people crave. Yeah, we lose.
So we were coming.
So actually to that, I mean, the ephemera I've found that, at least in the interactive literature community, we're not bad about keeping track of the games, we're terrible about keeping track of the experiences.
Right.
And the community history and stuff like that. And what I find interesting is that 20, 25 years ago, we were actually better about that when we had a quarterly magazine that was somewhere that people could put in. I'm sort of interested in people's thoughts about how can we encourage communities to maintain that sort of community history.
It's on my list. It's a great question.
As one of the old guard, I'm really interested in this topic.
Yeah, and I actually had some thoughts building on that. Like, one of the questions that's sort of floating around the edges of this is what are we preserving, who are we preserving for, and what will those people be looking for? And, some of the things that they might be looking for is creative process. How are these documents made? What is the creative community around them talking about? So design documents and communication among authors would be one thing to preserve there. Preserving the experience, like that's something we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
I don't want to, so we'll get to it then. But yeah, it's cool. But there are other reasons to preserve, in the moment. Preserving documents so that you remember the experience. Preserving documents so that you have continuity within a community of players or the community of the game world. I was talking before with the campaign marks. Also, documentation, to be used as publicity materials. Honestly, one of the ways that I've been engaging with the New World Magical and documentation recently is helping create their new publicity materials. And so going through the photographs, saying like, all right, what do these photographs say about the community? Which ones do we want to choose to show the public what our community is like? So there are lots of different reasons to engage with these documents, and I think that's one of the things that should be considered when saving it is who might be reading it. And of course, you never know who might be reading it. And what we think is, that's what we've been talking about as historians, what we think is important is never the whole picture of what is important, because there's so many different groups of people who have different values and different interests. I have no simple answers.
Like, how do you get a community to actually record itself, right?
Yeah.
We've been talking about that in LARP Shack, which is the community that Jason and I run, and we're like, oh my gosh, we should document something. Whoa. And I think one of the main ways is to kind of instill it as a value, I guess, in the community of like recognizing what benefit it will have to your actual community. As you were saying, maybe it's publicity, maybe it's there, but maybe it's just like this is who we are, and we want to continue that conversation and let more new people feel included by having all this stuff they can look at so they understand what they are coming into.
Yeah.
It's true. That's a good point.
Yeah.
I would love to hear from other Canadian second Jason.
One practical technique that historians use to look at community history from relatively recent past is oral history. And so, maybe that could be a thing that we might think about doing as a community is an oral history project. Because I think that that's the sort of thing that can really help fill in those gaps where it's like you look at like the conference program which you saved from 30 years ago, but what you don't know is that the two people that met on this panel got married and then became the founders of this whole additional game tradition because they met on this panel or something like that. So oral history can really help fill in some of those gaps. The difficulty, of course, is that it takes time and a certain amount of expertise to do good oral histories too. But I think that to a certain degree, we are doing some of that now because we have a good number of really excellent podcasts in our community. So those can definitely be. I think that those would go a long way to helping preserve some of that community history.
archivists, any final thoughts on what we should be preserving?
I have very strong thoughts about what we should be preserving. I feel very, very strongly that player-created artifacts are super important. When we talk about things, we tend to focus on the designers and the design team and kind of this, they have created a world and it gets privacy quite often. But the thing is, especially in the larger LARPs, everyone, if you consider LARPs as an experience, everyone has had a different experience and it does not always feature prominently that designer's idea. And player-created artifacts, the cape that they bought before the LARP and then they wore the whole time even though it was super hot, or you know, they did a drawing during the LARP and they did it in character and then they keep it and it has a meaning for them afterwards. And the narratives that they create that go along with it in terms of oral history. To me, to capture these kind of objects and the ideas and everything that goes around with them is much more likely to get a sense of what that experience was actually like. And which is not to say that the creative process and such is not also important, but given the unique nature of LARP, if we want to capture it as an experience, we have to document it as an experience.
Somewhat speaking of oral history, I want to do someday a semi-oral history of the post-event letter. This is a thing that a lot of campaign LARPs use to keep track of stuff between sessions. Every player writes up their own account of what happened during that game. And sometimes it's like a very, okay, yes, I used these skills, I used these magic items, but for a lot of people, like, it's their debrief. It's how they engage emotionally with what happened during the game, and they shift in and out of character as they're writing it. And like I would love to, get 100 of these from the same event and rush them on out the event and see if I could piece together what happened.
And then there's also the fan art or people who write postscript, headcanons.
Yes.
There's all the things that come after, even though they didn't occur in game, they are in fact artifacts of experience.
Absolutely.
This is a good segue into some more practical topics about how we do this, both as lay people and a little bit as professionals. So I'm interested in knowing, personally, how can LARP creators design with an eye toward preservation? Like, are there things that I could be consciously doing in creating materials for play that would be beneficial to you knuckleheads?
Acid-free paper?
Spoken picture.
Tell me more.
Create in-game incentives to document. In-game incentives to write down what happened, to write in-game notes to each other.
Dystopia Rising could use an archivist class.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they totally could.
So at the end of New World Magiscola, I made a Magiscola museum, which is an online museum. I'm glad you like it. It is a prototype of what I was kind of thinking. I got your ephemera from it and various people who contributed stuff. And I am not a natural website creator, but I made it on Wix. But one of the things I realized at the end, and I'll talk about this tomorrow also, is that it gave me entirely too much power. Because I was curating it all by myself and I didn't have a place for people to have interactions or really invest other than I put my stuff up here, so here you can see it. There's not a lot of motivation for them to look at more. So it's still a thing that I'm developing, but I think solid documentation of artifacts and is a big part of making that easier on the part of people that are there. So yes, again, we have people with the special class, the archivists, and in-game reasoning. I freaking love that idea. Even that's something they even do in massive multiplayer online games. There's people who are the photographer. They do it, why don't we? So yeah, there is all that, but I also think that I'm wandering a little now because I'm so excited, that we've got to find a way to make it an engaging place. And I don't necessarily, I have the skill set for understanding and codifying and talking about, but I don't necessarily have the skill set for making it engaging.
Sounds like you need some partners.
It does sound that I have heard about Omega, which is something. Omega. I keep on screwing up. My archivist friend told me about it
What is it?
after I finished making this website, and I was like,
What is it?
Omeka is an open source digital repository, but geared towards display, so
Yeah.
making exhibits.
Oh, like the thing you did.
yeah, like the thing I did, yeah. The only thing is I haven't looked at it in close, but again, I suspect that it's not actually designed as a space for interaction so much as an exhibition. So
That's the problem with a lot of
Yeah.
digital preservation is it's a
Little
challenge for a lot of even museums and people who are specialists in experience design.
Speaking of that, that's an interesting point. How do we preserve experience?
That's so I think that's what we were kind of like
Yeah.
looking at is you've got to preserve as many different perspectives. I think that's a really important part is to capture the variety of perspective that takes place during an experience. As I was saying, like you can take photographs, which is I know what some learners do, but that's going to only capture the visual experience, and you've lost a lot of the narrative if you've done that. You need to do it multimodally. You need to capture the photographs, and you need to have I love building into games ephemera and things like that, so that is captured. You need to intentionally ask people and maybe record what people have had about that experience with their permission. Obviously, post-game write-ups, all of these things, and get them from numerous perspectives, because everyone is going to, and reach out especially to, if you do have, try to get a good representation of what's going on from and be intentional about it. You cannot capture the experience of everyone, most likely.
And it seems like it's going to be easy to get stuff from the superfans. Like all
Right.
my nonsense in your archive, I send it to you right away because
Yeah.
I'm very excited to participate. But there's a lot of quiet people who are not going to do that
Right.
unless you reach out to them.
Yeah,
Right.
and help them feel empowered to tell their stories, especially, players who already belong to marginalized groups whose stories get overlooked or purposely silenced in other contexts. It's really, really important to make sure that those stories and those experiences get heard.
it's also important to have consent.
Yes.
which is-
With their permission.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when I was collecting stuff for the Magic School Museum, I only had one person turn me down in terms of, like, they had posted their stuff online. I said, I'd like to put it in the museum. They said, no thanks. And I went, okay. But there was a whole lot of me chasing people down and trying to, hey, you have this cool thing online, but yeah, consent's an important part of this, I feel.
But you can't really capture an experience unless you film the entire LARP from every multiple angle, which I guess you could do, but that would be a real.
It still wouldn't be an accurate
Wouldn't be accurate,
representation.
even that, like,
because it's just a view into it,
Yeah.
right?
As a film scholar, just shaking
Yeah.
my head.
Yeah.
And, like,
I'm sorry, Evan, I say wrong things.
And you can't give each person their own little head camera, because even that doesn't get what's going on inside people's heads.
And that's what the experience is really living.
the least capturable and most essential.
Can we talk a little bit about categorization, which I think is going to be a real bugaboo for this? I'm thinking about things like repository or collections, maybe not repositories, but collections that don't have metadata attached. Okay, that's strong. One of the cases was strong.
Librarians, take it away.
But beyond that, should we be thinking about categorization more broadly as creators, or should you be developing metadata that is describing the experience of LARP, for example?
You need to have basic metadata to remove and make anything findable and discoverable.
Do we need to talk about metadata? Does everybody know what we mean when we say metadata?
Does anybody not know what we mean when we say
You do not.
metadata?
Yeah, so metadata in 30 words or less.
Metadata is data about data. So, object, description of object, title, date, things describing that object. That's metadata, right? Data about information.
And there's all sorts of different frameworks for metadata. Librarians are big on actually creating whole systems of this is, exactly how there's a Library of Congress subject heading for everything, and so theoretically, you can find anything within that subject just by clicking on the subject heading. But like, on the other hand, tagging is a form of metadata, and tagging, people all the time like create their own sort of schemas on their, blogs or whatever for tags, and that's totally relevant too. It's just, that as far as that goes, like when you're creating those schemas, you need to think about who you want to be able to find your information, basically. So, like, are you just creating these tags for yourself so that you will be able to find the information, or are you creating it so that visitors to your site can find the information? And if that's the case, then, it's important to think about, like, okay, is this word accurately describing this, or do I need to redo my tag schema? I mean, and usually it's a iterative process.
So you're asking about like, should we categorize the general? So like, as a person who's worked a lot with, so I actually was working until life exploded and got in the way of trying to create a metadata schema with James Stewart to describe games, like free-form games, so that they would be found in a database, so they would be findable. But that fell apart, but I'm hoping to someday resurrect it.
That was solving a very specific
problem, which this is not, right? This is a very general problem. That was just can people find games they want to play?
Is there a need for a consortia to develop like the Dublin core?
All the librarians in the room go, I think that I do think that some kind of standardization I think that if we want to do this, I think that there needs to be some kind of categories that are standard, and I think that they should be very minimal, though. I think that the thing is you don't want to create a very intense standard because then no one will use it.
Yep.
We have done that for our institutional repository, and we're like, hey, professors, fill out all this information about your stuff. No.
Yeah, I have a question. If it's too far into the weeds, just let me know and we can talk about it afterwards. So from a technologist point of view, I'm curious if metadata is just going to go away as advanced artificial intelligence and deep learning and blah 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 will just get you what you want without you knowing how to search for it necessarily. I mean, is that 100% sci-fi?
Yeah. Oh boy, that's a big question.
I'm going to speak as a humanities person real quick and say no, because again, that would actually foreground one particular understanding of objects and such. Like, so in terms of curatorial versus archiving, like if I'm going to put together a show, I need that metadata in order to kind of draw the kind of correlations I want.
And so does the AI.
So,
but there's an artistry to curation that I do not believe AI is as of yet capable
That's
of.
not what I was suggesting. You still need finding aids. You still need the ability to, regardless if it's a human or a machine.
Yeah.
Right.
So obviously librarians do a lot of thinking about this, and there are things on the horizon, particularly the idea of linked data.
Is that a thing that's a thing that's like, it's going to happen in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years now?
I mean, it will happen eventually. It's like self-driving cars, like, it's going to happen eventually. But you might be actually able to better explain it than I can.
Linked data?
Yeah.
God, this is so exciting, doing LARP and linked data. So linked data is basically the idea that you have information that is, instead of like linear, more of a web. And so like connections can be formed kind of organically through AI and also through coding. So the big thing is called RDF. But like basically, so if you have like a creator, once you hit that creator is going to link out to a bunch of other things throughout the web and pull that information in. But again,
Not just in library
and
catalogs.
labs, but like throughout the ye old web. And the idea is because right now it's very difficult to often make those kind of correlations and pull things together. But the problem is, of course, that is currently also all needing to be created.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing AI right now that is creating those kinds of correlations. Once we get that in place, there might be a good way, but right now there's nothing. And I don't know if, my other thing is, so my husband is actually, like, works in this kind of field as well, and as far as I can tell, technologists don't care about this problem, like
About
librarianship.
librarian problems.
So they don't, right? They don't care about librarian problems, and so no, it's true. We don't make them any money, and so I think that this is a thing that's probably just not very high priority. It might be able to be fixed, but I don't think we're really on the radar even. I don't know. Am I wrong? I'm probably wrong. I'm very controversial. I'm tired.
To that, a lot of the geeks are very into this stuff. I mean, I
Right.
know a lot of communities that are into it. The problem is the money isn't.
The money is not into
Yeah,
it.
the angel funders.
Evan, and then
The best free-form database I've found is actually in French, by a French developer named Stéphane Ragoni, which I have in Excel format if you want. I don't read French, but I actually I can tell he's put not only his own, I mean the official like your player count and that sort of thing, but also his own subjective reviews in the margins, right? And so this thing is already like straddling the boundary between both archive and also itself, something
Is a piece of
exactly. So what do we do with that? And also, that there are probably other people in Europe who are also concerned with these questions that maybe we could be in dialogue with.
Yeah, you should find them.
We need to reach out. I think we need to figure out the group of people here who are interested in this and reach out and have conversations with the people in Europe and across the country and the world.
I mean, I'm a hoarder, so I hoarded this database for myself. I hoarded actually a bunch of these free forms for myself. I mean that's the
Love hoarders.
Okay.
God bless you.
Yeah, but then to pry it from my golden hands is the
But that's the thing. Like there are probably a ton of other small community archives just like this,
right?
That we just don't know about, and that's why living games is so important.
Yeah.
That all of these communities can talk to each other and make these connections, so that we can have multiple sources of knowledge for this and get this preserved in multiple ways.
So you had a question or comment?
Actually.
Okay, all right.
I mean, one thing, especially for these things that are like, we're not dealing with in the moment, but we're looking backwards at existing corpuses that we want to preserve now before they go away, is it's always useful to look into what grants might offer, even small grants. And, you can find these, there's venues to find these through public libraries, people historical societies, university libraries can direct one through this. But this is like what grant makers, this is actually what some grant making agencies are interested in. This kind of stuff, as silly as it might seem to us, like this is what people want sometimes when they're looking for grant funding opportunities.
Can we talk, please go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say on the grant funding opportunity front, those of you that are faculty members at institutions, this is something that you can also think about partnering directly with your libraries on. Yeah, exactly. And so, because if there's a faculty member that's interested in preserving a thing, then the library itself is going to be much more amenable to that. But the other option, there's a few options, right? And I think that we should probably do all of them. But one is kind of surfacing in our own communities, kind of making those connections of where are the informal archives, which will help archivists down the road to be able to kind of, when they do decide we want to preserve this stuff in an institution, they can kind of see here are the collections and here's what we should track down and get. But another piece is, like making those partnerships with archives. And by making the partnerships, I just mean like reaching out to, like literally like emailing the librarian who is in charge of that.
Like the Murray collection?
The Murray collection, and just, saying, hey, would you be interested in some more stuff? What sort of stuff might you be interested in? Because it's really a dialogue. It's with archivists, it's not one thing where it's like either yes or no oftentimes. Like it is, okay, so what do you mean by like game ephemera, And then, you have a conversation, and especially if it's like creating a relationship for ongoing archival deposits, then that's another thing where they will help shape what is actually put into those repositories.
So we've mentioned the Straub Museum, we mentioned the Murray collection. Who else is doing this? Somebody must be doing this work now in some way.
There's,
No, you guys know better than me.
Someone, do you know?
Yeah, John Peterson is collecting a bunch of stuff. Yep. A bunch of TSR stuff mostly.
Is he affiliated with an institution, or is he just
No.
So that's the problem.
It's like
It's
this
a guy.
guy.
In his basement,
He's
Yeah.
a really brilliant guy.
Yeah.
hooked up to him.
I was in the
Yeah, I know there's a librarian at Villanova who has a giant collection of Choose Your Own Adventure books and Choose a Path and game books.
Oh no.
Yes.
Oh, my heart.
It was so big it literally broke his attic floor because it was so heavy. But that's the thing, like there are these, but he has it as his personal collection, not in his professional librarian.
wow.
Yeah.
So it's, I think it's marked as a enterprise is uniquely siloed.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I was gonna say, what I know, there are collections certainly of things like comic book.
Oh yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
there are tons
Yeah.
of comic book archives.
Zines.
And zines, but those are more also traditionally printed matter,
Yeah.
and so I think that they are a little bit easier for people to wrap their heads around. I mean, I also feel that even though there are a ton of librarians who game, they are not, it's still not necessarily considered a thing often worth examining and preserving as historical artifact. Like, often now, like when I talk about librarians and like game collections, they'll be like, oh, so we just want to buy a bunch of board games for our students to play, which is also cool, but not what we're, like the entire like ALA gamer think tank table, which I'm part of, is pretty much focused on that, and I think that it would be interesting to have start a conversation with that group, and I just thought of that now. Thank you, panel, to talk about this problem, because I don't think that people, except for those few libraries, are really thinking of it.
And there's a few like video game collections.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
forget where those are,
So-
but like there's
What?
The Canon Judd's collection was in Arizona State, or is it?
Yeah.
I think
So
so.
there's one of the one in Berlin.
Yeah, and there's one in Berlin, the
Right,
Computer
right.
Spiele Museum.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Kate, and
I
then-
was just gonna say, in terms of places that we could start a dialogue with, like look at, again, where the game studies the really important game studies programs are, the places that currently do that with more than one professor, or the ones that do it with just one professor, right? Because again, if it has a direct curricular integration, then the archive is going to think, oh, this is in our mission.
Yep.
And the other thing is, those archives for whom their mission, it's going to be a little bit broader than we collect game stuff, but it might be like, we collect things on popular culture, right? So like the UMass archive, their mission is we collect things related to social change, right? But like, that's why I'm saying like some are like popular culture, and it's those archives that I think would be most interested in this stuff.
Okay, so a question back.
Yeah, I was wondering, I came in a few minutes late, so maybe I missed this, but I was hoping you could speak a little bit to the question of why collect, like why save things? Not, should we or shouldn't we, but more like, if you could imagine one thing that would be different in the world as a result of you having made these efforts, like it probably would be different for each of you, but what would some of those things be?
Did you say that we've addressed that, or do you want to comment on that?
We have addressed it, but I wanted to put a secondary comment to it, which is that Jason,
First Jason.
First Jason, I think at Gen Con last year posted all these images from a museum of role playing that they had done.
Yeah.
And I saw it and I almost cried. It was beautiful. The objects were there, they were meaningful, you could see connections that weren't there. The fact that it wasn't just an image, and you could almost sense when they used to put out those stupid ash can editions, the humanness of it. And I earlier had talked about capturing experiences, capturing meaning, and I specifically want to cite that as being one of the things that made me feel that this was important, was your post. Because I was thinking about the meaningfulness of objects that seem for a time to not matter because they're gates or because they're stapled together on your kitchen table, but they matter for the humanity that they represent.
So a moderator point as the jet engine begins again. We have about 15 minutes, which means I'm going to open it up to general questions, and I would love to hear your thoughts and to have a dialogue here, and we'll start with you.
Good. Something that came to mind when you're talking about who is going to fund these sorts of collections is we're currently in a moment in the LARP community where we're trending towards commercialization of the hobby. Businesses emerging who are creating viable profit-bearing businesses. And I'm wondering if there's a trend in other fields of more documentation happening, more collecting happening, more funds being available for that sort of thing as industries commercialize. Comic books, for example, is a huge commercial industry.
But I would also say with comic books and video games, and I think also eventually, like I said, I think we're on the cusp of this with analog games, is that as it becomes is seen just generally in the population and in academia specifically, it becomes seen as more important to preserve not just high culture, but also popular culture, because popular culture is where, especially these social movements come out of, right?
Sure.
That is, I think, a big part of the reason. To get to your question about why, right? I think that's a big part of the reason why I think these games have a much more meaning than just as recreation, right? The panel that I'm on tomorrow is about playing and being ourselves, non-binariness in LARP, right? The conversation that we just had today in preparation for that panel was we all realized that our experiences LARPing really helped us to come out to ourselves and to others, right? And that's the sort of thing you look at nobody's right now would say that that isn't important. That's a huge social movement, is the redefinition of gender, right? And so LARP is playing a big role, an outsized role in that history, and we can already tell that right now. And I'm sure that there are many other, because history, it's always you get more and more clear as it gets further and further away. You can see the bigger and bigger picture. And I think that's gonna, there will be other things like that, where it turns out that LARP is actually really central to this or that social movement.
How do we get people to play the archive?
Play the archive.
Yeah. As in, I help run games on demand.
Right.
Yeah, and hardly any games that are run have been published. Past 5 years. We have a 5-year window, more or less.
Yeah.
And then the game goes out of style. Fiasco has survived. A couple of Monster Hearts has survived, but not many. So we have about 5 years of good time for that game, and then it shifts on.
Yeah.
We don't have a classics track.
Right.
We should.
We should.
I'm so excited about that because actually, even I'm just gonna do a personal story because I just joined Jason's group a few years ago.
Inside baseball.
And I'm suddenly I really want to play this X old classic indie game, but I'm so afraid to bring it up because like I know you guys have already like done that and like
That's so
wanna
2006.
I'm only so out of vote. So I think that that's.
But things will come back around.
Yeah.
That's the thing, like,
And
once,
this is
if
roach
they
crawling right here.
keep preserving, if we keep so like I think that's the key, right? Is like we need to be, if we want these things to be remembered, we have to be one, not ourselves going, well, we've been doing this for 15 years. That's old hat. Recognize that that's not old hat to a lot of people, and it's a new thing to a lot of people. Those databases, like you're talking about, the freeform databases, things like that, those collections, build your game library and keep it and intentionally pull it out. Like a lot of people in this room actually have like a lot of cachet and power to reintroduce those kinds of games and make them cool again. So I think that we have to be intentional about that, and I want the classics track.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also says something like the fact that there is this brief, intense period of focus on a particular game or on a particular family of games. I think that also says something. What is it about that historical moment or that moment for that particular social group that made that game speak to them for those 3 years? And that's something to look for. It's always sad when a game fades away, but I think it's really interesting to see why it was big for that moment for those people.
So we have a good question back there.
We were talking about engagement and how to get people to give information about the experiences. I was reminded of a website that a friend threw together very half-heartedly. It's been an alpha for I don't know how many years.
10 years-ish.
10 years, right. Which was called Resonate, and it was basically just a site where you could put up, these are the games I played and this is the character I played. And people got really excited about it. Like, if nobody was supposed to put up, people got really excited about putting stuff up there, which, was a problem because it did not actually get developed. But I was, basically I was wondering, as archivists and people looking for metadata, does that seem like a kind of tool that would be useful for collecting things? Okay.
Probably.
Things that allow people to, especially if they're not too difficult, things that allow people to self-submit and self-archive that stuff we'll have to sort through and stuff like that, but that's at least keeping it in a place that can be accessed for a later date. And luckily for us, like you say, people are really excited. I mean, gosh, everyone loves talking about their character, right? Like Jason has a booth that he raises money for, just letting people tell about their character. It's a well-honored pastime.
But and building on that, but also making sure that they're telling their stories, that they know that their stories will be accepted, and that they know that it will be safe for them to tell their stories. Going back to making sure as wide a range of people are able to tell their stories, not just the people who have power in game or out of game, but newbies, people from marginalized groups, making sure that their stories will be accepted and that their personal lives will be safe.
The gentleman in the fourth row.
This ties in with a couple of things discussed earlier about how can we create best practices for what to put out there for those self-submissions. So we capture the right sorts of material for what.
Okay, so
write a alerts document.
Part of me, like as we're speaking, I'm realizing that we should probably just make this like a feature of Living Games conferences or something. I don't know, because like that sort of, or like, God, a committee. Because in my job, like I'm involved in creating best practices documents all the time, but it's a committee. You have to do the environmental scan, read some literature about how other people have done the best practices. It's so boring.
That sounds real boring.
It's
but it's really important.
So a question back there.
So I don't run a website if you're Neil called larplibrary.org, which is kind of intended as a thing for people to be able to download and run games as GMs. it occurs to me that it would actually be a pretty okay tool for archiving the kind of ephemera that you're talking about too. And I'm okay with us doing it. I think Neil is probably okay with us doing it.
Did you just volunteer?
Yes, I did.
It was entirely a question of whether you were going to build it or whether I was.
I mean, it's open source. We can work together on it. We have a Slack channel. People should join it. Talk to me. I'll get you on the Slack. I'm serious about this.
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh, sorry. My name is Nat Budin.
Hi, Nat.
Hey, Nat.
Hey.
Nice to meet you, Nat.
We're gonna hold you to this.
You guys are making software tools for like the Intercon LARP community that are like incredibly useful for many years.
And thank you for that.
I want to talk to your very generous offer and the various other questions here real quick, because in terms of what Evan was asking, to get people to play, sometimes seeing the ephemera and the people talking about it, or a video of something is a very, very effective place, and not always a commercial, mind you. Just these surrounding things can make it appear more approachable. I know when I want people to play Fiasco if they haven't played before, I send them to watch Tabletop, and normally that kind of helps. because to be honest, it's scary for people who are not in indie gaming. If they've been playing D&D forever, to see other people play makes a difference.
Right.
And to see the effects or hear people talk about it, it makes a difference.
Do you have a question, Sam?
Yeah, I promise this is devil's advocate, and I'm actually struggling with this. Is there a sort of a aspect of the ephemerality of the LARP as a feature, rather than something to be preserved that is? I'm going to use the word threatened by attempts to preserve, however, meaning how it intersects with surveillance, how it it's a tangle, but it feels, especially with some of the communities that are most invested with LARP, that sense of this is being recorded. How can this be weaponized?
It changes the experience.
It changes the experience. So I mean, it's a big thing. But how do you?
And that's why, I mean, I personally am a proponent of oral histories as a, basically, there are plenty of best practices for oral histories out there that are quite easy to find, where you can, you're basically explicitly getting the person's consent, and even if you do the interview, then you give them the whole transcript to read through, and they can X out anything that they want removed from the interview, and that does not get archived, right? So that's the sort of thing where there are ways to kind of deal with that historians have created, and there's certainly, I mean, if we're thinking about human subject studies, there's also that sort of thing. But does that answer your question?
I think that's
So moderator note, we have about 5 minutes, which means we'll probably have one more question, which will be yours if you want it, but you had a comment first?
Yeah, just from an arts perspective, it does absolutely change the nature of it. And that's one of the reasons we come back to consent. If a community feels strongly about not, then we accept that not. And it is right there at that time, and nobody else gets to know.
Yep.
And that can be a part of it.
So on the staff before our cyberpunk campaign, and we have tells, we have media created by the players, audio recordings, but a lot of these things are very personal to the players. They're emotionally intimate. And I was wondering, how would you pitch to these people to have these come forth more in public light?
That's a great question.
So there's a question of when, right? So
Archives have a very long tradition of
Yeah.
holding
Sealing
things back and sealing things
Yeah.
until the people give permission for them to be released. So that's one way. A lot of people seal letters and things like that until after their death or after their family's death.
Or years after they're dead.
So that's one way.
Passage of time.
I do find, though, that most people are really excited to share. They're excited. They have thought, they have time, they have energy, and nobody asks them. They spent 10 hours building this thing that they used in the LARP once, and nobody asks how they built it, because they're like, oh, that was cool. And they're like, yes, it is cool, and that's it. So they are already already invested in these objects and they want to share them most of the time.
And with that, I think I'd like to thank our 2020 Living Games Preservation Committee.